again, thank you guys so much for inviting me to come. I'm talking to you today about something that is really important to me personally, and I'll get into a little bit of that. And kind of where my research stems from, and then how we can use the research in a really pragmatic, practical way to help adults and to help us also reach our goals in terms of meeting all the new standards for all of the myriad of tests that we now get the pleasure of taking with our students. Um, and so, as Eric said, I'm going to ask you guys a few questions along the way. I certainly want to tailor this to you as much as possible, and certainly at the end of the presentation, if you guys have any questions or would like any of my materials, I'm more than willing to share any and all with you guys. So again, thank you for having me. So if you have ever done your taxes by hand, you know how complicated and exclusionary government writing can be. The rereading, constant comprehension checks, the anxiety of doing something wrong and getting in trouble. But what if you needed help from the government and could not afford to hire someone to help you? Or what if no help really existed at all for what you were doing? So who am I? In 2009, I was in a class as part of my doctorate program called The Politics and Policy of Reading Instruction. I chose to read a book called Reading Against Democracy by Patrick Shannon. It made me remember my home parish and the parishes that were surrounding me, which were ravaged by Hurricane Rita shortly after the same hurricane season Hurricane Katrina had gutted New Orleans. Friends from home, mostly rural farm workers or offshore workers, were really being taken to the cleaners by their insurance companies, while FEMA refused to accept their applications for federal assistance. People really needed help with the paperwork more than anything. They just needed to be able to support their families. But really, the institutions and the insurance companies stood in the way of help. So, to kind of get started with our questions, I'm curious what government forms or applications you guys have filled out yourselves, not necessarily with your students, just for yourself. And what kinds of problems have you experienced through that process?
Okay, so and this is where you can use the question feature to respond to this. So Regina says FAFSA.
Oh, great. We're going to talk about FAFSA.
Yeah, many people probably have experience with FAFSA, yes.
Yes. Um, and then any problems that anyone's experienced filling out
Okay.
government applications or
Here,
forms?
taxes,
Yep.
food stamps,
Yep.
FAFSA, passport.
Oh, that's a good one that I haven't thought about recently, but certainly have filled out as well.
Hmm.
Um, One of the things that a lot of people speak about when they speak about having filled them out themselves and problems um, is not only the applications themselves, but then the notices that you get afterwards, the requests for more information. It really just kind of becomes a web of complex texts that seems almost never ending at times. Um, so hopefully we'll kind of be able to get through some more of that. And I want you guys to start thinking about as very advanced um, literacy users, how that then in turn affects your students, perhaps.
I think on that point, Regina chimed in saying it's not only at the end when you have these follow-up papers, but Regina makes a note that having all the required forms necessary to complete the form. So even at the
Yes,
beginning, you're having
that's
to
true.
navigate and negotiate having multiple forms with you at the same time. And another type of form that was mentioned was citizenship application. And having
Ah,
helped people with that, I know that form can be quite complicated.
very complicated. And getting back to Regina's point, even the need to start and stop when you start doing some of these applications, because you realize midway through that they never told you you needed XYZ further documentation. So certainly it is very confusing. Um, and the whole process in doing it myself and in helping others really made me wonder if government applications served as a literacy test. to really bar people from getting help. Whether it was intentional or unintentional is a different question, but is that really how they're functionally serving? And that really stayed with me. And so as I was preparing to choose a topic for my dissertation, I realized that I was really interested in the experiences of families and individuals who were seeking assistance from government systems. In 2010, President Obama signed the Plain Writing Act, which incorporated the use of plain language in any federal government document that was intended for public use. So certainly that includes applications for federal assistance. But before my dissertation work, no one had really gone in to evaluate how well that had been implemented since the passage of that law. And so that's kind of one of the things that I was looking at going into my dissertation. So with the current rise, somebody mentioned the SNAP program or food stamps, with the current rise of food insecurity in the US, especially among women, children, and the elderly, I chose to look at two of the largest food assistance programs in the US and analyze them through usability testing. So I looked at the National School Lunch Program and then the SNAP program, which is formerly known as food stamps. And what I did to look at it was I gathered two adult groups on opposite ends of the literacy skill spectrum. And I wanted to see how each were going to navigate the application materials. And hopefully by looking at two separate ends of the spectrum, I could infer across it. So I looked at 6 burgeoning adult readers who were enrolled in adult basic education courses and 6 PhD students in education, and had them separately analyze both the National School Lunch Program application and the SNAP program application, and basically fill it out and see what kind of errors they made. After I looked at their errors, the results were really interesting. Neither group, whether they were ABE students or doctoral students in education, could complete the forms without having significant numbers of errors. What I then looked at, though, was how the different types of errors that the groups had really said something about their ability to metacognate or understand their own understanding when reading the forms. Even though the ability to complete was much higher for adult doctoral students, it was still only 66%, which is a D, if not an F in a lot of systems. And so, although none of the adult literacy students were able to complete the applications independently without having at least one critical error. So I guess to summarize, what I found was that both groups struggled mightily through the processes, and the difference really in how they interacted with the forms was how much that they could utilize their own monitoring of their comprehension. So in talking with them afterward, I asked, what made the difference for you, or what were some of your problems? And all of them talked about how confusing not only the application form themselves were, but the denials, waivers, acceptance letters, the request for more documentation, the documentation that you had to have to fill out the forms. All of those things, again, really served as a web that barred them from getting help. And then the last thing that a lot of them talked about that as adult educators we think about a lot but maybe don't talk about as much as we should is that adults are very risk averse. And so the threat of embarrassment and stigma, and Brown and Levinson talk about it as face threats, for the participants, their families, and even the government workers themselves was very high in this situation. So it really stopped people from seeking help within the system itself. So all of that is kind of the background knowledge about where I come from in studying this. But in my work as an ABE professional, I've certainly helped a lot of my students with these kinds of applications and forms. And so I was curious from you guys, what kinds of assistance forms are you helping your students with in your programs?
Right. So in addition to some of the things that were already mentioned, are there other forms that you've been working with in your classrooms or your tutoring sessions with your students?
One that I'm shocked, or I would be shocked, is not being talked about is healthcare.gov and that application and filling out
Okay.
all the forms associated with that.
The first thing that popped up is housing applications.
Ah, very good. Yep.
Okay. So applications more generally. Employment applications,
Yes.
leases.
Very good.
Let's see what else. Library cards,
It's a good one.
social security numbers.
Disability is one that I've helped some of my students
Uh-huh.
fill out.
Okay. So a nice range here of
Oh,
things that people have been doing.
and certainly all very complex texts. So I guess there are really only two bodies of knowledge that I want us to kind of maybe think through a little bit before we get into how do we help our students to access these forms and applications and processes in a way that really builds their comprehension skills while we're also addressing their needs. Um, so the first is when we look at bringing in these types of authentic materials, whether it's a housing application or um, the application for immigration or any of the other ones you guys mentioned, how do we figure out how that fits into our curriculum? How do we assess the complexity of the material itself? Um, with the Common Core State Standards, one of the um, directives is that we teach our students closing and skills to better comprehend complex texts. So, how do we figure out how complex some of these texts are? And so, the CCSS stipulates a three-pronged um, test, if you will, of text complexity. The first is qualitative. And really, what we're looking at there is what is the purpose for this text as we look at what we're bringing in? So, is it to apply for housing or to become a citizen? And then, second, what is the language conventionality and clarity? So, is it clear ambiguous? Is it clear language or is it ambiguous and full of jargon? So to use an example from a FEMA application, one of the things that I ran across was pre-positioned commodities are located at X and X. And then I read it a couple of times and realized these people are talking about food and water. Why can't we just use the words food and water? So again, as you're looking at these complex, authentic materials, looking at the language conventionality and clarity, and then the demands of knowledge that come with that text. So, does it really require everyday knowledge or specialized, extensive, discipline specific knowledge? Um, and then, further, still inside of the qualitative demand, looking at the structure of the form or of the application itself. Is it very sequential? Is it cause and effect? Is it all over the place? One of the things that I've found in working with students with these types of texts is that it can go from a sequential to a descriptive and back to sequential. So even in within the text itself, the structure completely changes along the way. When looking at the right side of the triangle, the quantitative side, we're looking at things that are really more equivalent to readability. So word length, sentence length, text cohesion. I don't know if any of you guys have used, there's some computer-based programs that you can use to figure some of that stuff out. One of the things that I always caution um, any kind of teacher who's bringing in materials is not to just use that. A lot of times we use, oh, this is a third grade reading level, so I can bring it into my classroom, or this is a ninth grade reading level, and that's where my students are, so let me bring this into my classroom. I'm really encouraging you to think about all three of those, whether you're bringing in forms and application materials or just information that you think the students would be interested in. Don't rule out something just because it is a higher level of text complexity or readability, or lower for that matter. You really need to look at all three, including the last piece, which is the blue part of the triangle down there, the reader and task. So the document itself has components that we're going to analyze, but also the reader is the third part of what makes any text complex or not. So as you're bringing in documents, I want you to think about who are your students? What are their cognitive capabilities? Um, what is their attention, their memory like, their critical analytic abilities? What is their motivation for this? Obviously, even if it's a very complex text, if it's something like a citizenship application, their motivation is probably very high. And how is that then going to impact their interaction with the text? Um, oh, sorry, Eric, were you
That's
going to
okay.
jump in?
Yeah, Leo, I was going to say that's an important point about these sort of just raw quantitative measures of readability or these sorts of level things. I was in a class the other day. I was talking to some students who were talking about some research at the K-12 level that when younger students are given a free choice to choose something, they tend to choose things that are above what the teacher presumed to be the readability level. That the students would
Right.
be comfortable at, and they do perfectly fine with those texts, right? Or they do okay with those texts. So sometimes we underestimate what our students can do in terms of these raw or sort of generic readability figures.
Absolutely. And that hints at that idea of motivation, but also their experiences. If it's something that students have prior knowledge about and interest in, that certainly is going to lend to students having a higher understanding, regardless of what the readability level is. Um, and that kind of gets to this second body of literature to keep in mind as we continue to talk about some of these things. And that is both schema theory and metacognition. Um, we could go into this for a while, I guess, but the general overarching idea is that our students' brains work to store information by paying attention to something, selecting that information to move through our short-term memory, and then storing it in our long-term memory. And according to schema theory, all of our new knowledge, all of our units of knowledge are called schemata. And so within each one of those units, there's information not only about what it's about, but also how that information is supposed to be used. And the information is mapped to other similar or related content in our long-term storage. And so I have a little model. It probably looks a little bit like a house. I'm not an artist. I wish I was. But what I was trying to imply in the visual is um, if you think about a common structure in Greek architecture, the pediment and column edifice, that's what I'm trying to mimic here. Um, so in Greek and Roman temple architecture, the triangle at the top that is supported by the columns is usually decorated with symbols of gods or goddesses, and it usually indicates what the structure's function was. And so for me, the structure of literacy for all of our students is comprehension. But what supports that? What holds it up? You'll see at the center is a student's prior knowledge. So how can we tap that prior knowledge to extend out their vocabulary on the one hand, or the level of text complexity that we expose them to on the right? And all three of those components really hold up and foster their comprehension. So metacognition then is one's ability to think about all of those components when you come across a vocabulary word that you don't necessarily know, to recognize, oh, I've never seen this before. How could I go about figuring out what it means? Or this is new content to me, or this is a new structure of text to me. How can I go about figuring out that information? And so my overarching question after working through my research was, in working with students, if we know that these materials are really complex texts, um, how can we bring them into our classrooms and also advance the students' comprehension skills. So not just a matter of, yeah, let me sit down with you and help you to fill this out, but how can I help you to understand, first of all, what this is about and how it impacts you, and relates to your prior experiences? And then how can you move forward and apply these skills to a new situation, to a new type of text, or to a new application? And so, unfortunately, I think we're so time crunched these days. For me, I always want to consider that delicate balance of how do we deliver authentic content in our classrooms, and at the same time also develop the skills that we need, to meet the standards that we have to meet. So I kind of always think about that as, a balance. So, how have I gone about doing this in my own classrooms with students? Um, this is not my concept. I certainly need to say this is from, Understanding by Design. I think frequently, in some adult education classrooms, we have more of the instructor centered model where we choose a textbook, or even worse, a textbook is chosen for us, um, or by a publisher. And then we have to write our syllabi, revise our lectures, prepare everything based on that material. But how can we really shift our thinking to instead have a more student centered focus, where really what we're trying to work on is students' broad learning skills? And how can we set our instructional practices to help students to meet those specific learning objectives? And how can we assess them for those specific learning objectives? And then last, how can they apply those things to their real lives?
Oh,
Oh,
when
sorry.
you go back for a second, so Risa pointed out as she was looking at this is that kind of to respond to that, she creates a bulletin board entitled "Reading for Life," right? So I
Mm,
think the teachers are proactive, kind of in dealing with this kind of top-down model and kind of trying to develop other ways to get across to students and give
that's
students
awesome.
opportunities to work on real life literacy.
Absolutely. And that actually leads really nicely into the next thing that I was going to talk about, which is what I talk about with my students a lot of times is, okay, well, let's talk about real world literacy or real world tasks. And that's, again, not my term, but, I think it's really salient for the students that we work with. Um, you have to know materials to pass the GED test or whatever we use now, depending on your state. But how do I know that the skills that I'm teaching you, you then can take and have that enduring understanding, that last bubble? Um, Ultimately, how can you take hopefully what you're learning in this classroom and apply it to your real life? Um, and so I have an example, that I have completed recently, in collaboration with a whole lot of people. Again, it's certainly not just me, but, um, I worked with FEMA and the Governor's Office of Homeland Security in Louisiana, as well as the University of New Orleans, the Center for Hazards Assessment, Response, and Technology. And what we were looking at was the FEMA disaster assistance materials. Again, very complex texts, but something that my students in Louisiana, and really all along the coast, um, needed to understand so that they could make good decisions for themselves and for their families. So, what we tried to do was utilize reading comprehension strategies within these authentic materials so that our students could not just learn skills, but learn them in a way that directly applies to their real life. So before I kind of get into that, I think we all have some comprehension strategies that are our favorites in terms of our bag of tricks. Does anyone want to share what theirs are?
And again, you can type it in this way, either, for the types of documents that you were listing earlier, the housing applications, the
Right.
social security number, the citizen, either things that you've used directly and explicitly with those sorts of forms and documents, or things that you do more generally in the class.
Right. And while you guys are kind of answering the question, I've toggled over to a form from FEMA. It's called Help After a Disaster, an applicant's guide to individuals and households, I believe.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I can't see the other side of it. Households program. So this was developed after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. But I would like to call your attention to page 8. First of all, it's interesting to note that this document is this is the how to fill out your FEMA form. And the document itself is 29 pages long, which irony right there, because the form is only a page.
So it takes 29 pages to explain how
Little
to
bit
fill out a
ridiculous.
page.
Yes, I particularly like this page about program eligibility with all of the conditional language. So it says to receive money or help for housing needs that are a result of the disaster, all of the following must be true. And you can see they have things like your home is an area that has been declared a disaster by the president. Your home is in an area where you live the majority of the year. Like, what does some of this stuff mean? You are not able to live in your home now. You cannot get there, etc. Um, Again, all of this, they give a bunch of stipulations and say all of this must be true. Or then you get to the bottom of the page and it says you may not be eligible if whole bunch more.
Mm-hmm.
Again, what do words like adequate mean? Or um, the conditional language is a very big issue that we meet up with in working with some of um, these materials with our students.
I can speak from personal experience of working with citizenship students when they're filling out the citizenship forms, and every so often there's a question where the meaning can be slightly ambiguous. So I remember one of the hardest cases I had was with a Chinese woman, an older Chinese woman, who during the Cultural Revolution in China had been put in a prison, right? Because
Right.
during the Cultural Revolution, enemies, the government that the people that the government that was an enemy were put in prisons,
Right.
and oftentimes put in mental institutions, right? And so on the citizenship form, it says, have you ever been incarcerated, or have you ever been put in a mental institution?
Right.
And so she and I talked for a long time about how to fill that out, because technically that was true, right?
Right.
But certainly by the spirit of what the law was looking for, it was not, right? But with the citizenship form, if you say something that's not true, even if it's a minor thing, that's
Right.
enough to start the deportation proceedings, right? And so we talked
Well,
for a long time about what are we going to say, because if you say yes, then it raises a red flag and you have to go through extra processing and things like that. And so um, these words like
absolutely.
adequate, these words like where do you live the majority of the time, we can get into what seem like semantic debates, but have real world impact on people.
One of the examples from the food stamps application, um, they have the person who's filling it out say what they expect their expenses to be a month from now.
Hmm.
And so the entire form asks you basically to prognosticate about what you think is going to happen next month. And if you are in an environment where you possibly need food stamps, it's going to be pretty difficult for you to track um, your exact expenses. And I mean, it's difficult for anyone, to be quite honest.
Hmm.
But then the form itself is followed up with a perjury statement that says, I can guarantee that all of these things that I have said are true. Otherwise, there's penalty that can include going to jail.
Hmm.
But you just asked the person to prognosticate.
Right.
How could they possibly say?
Right.
So again, that ambiguousness, and just it's calling on the reader to draw on prior knowledge that may or may not apply to the situation. Um, and so, how do you go about helping to scaffold people's understanding? almost like a translation in many ways.
One of the things that Risa mentioned when we were asking about, and Risa, I'm hoping I'm saying your name correctly, um, that they give synonyms for more advanced vocabulary, and then as part of it, they also fill out dummy forms, right? So, go through the process and really work with these things until it's time to actually try to submit it.
Absolutely. Even in terms of just the healthcare.gov, I had my own dummy account, which I'm sure that the government doesn't like very much. But I mean, again, how do you mimic these kinds of real world text without actually exposing students to them ahead of time?
Right.
Um, what we did for at least the FEMA example was went through and deduced for the specific kinds of topics that were addressed, whether it was hurricane things to know or preparation basics or evacuation information, how could we integrate a reading comprehension strategy that would not only help to teach the students that particular strategy, but help them to understand the information better? So one of the examples that we used, we looked at information on evacuation decisions like driving times and fuel costs, and we paired that information up with a problem solving strategy. So really helping people to think through what it means to evacuate and calculate how long travel can take and how much they might need for 3 meals a day for several days. So I mean, certainly those are all real world problems, um, but how can we teach a strategy that then they can use to understand the information in the moment, but apply to other situations as well?
And I mentioned at the top of the hour that we'll be sending out a PDF, so that very, I think, helpful chart about particular aspects of the form and what sort of
Yes.
comprehension strategy they associated with it. You don't have to worry about trying to scribble that down very quickly. You'll get that when we send the PDF out.
And if you guys are interested in, we actually wrote a couple of template lessons that were very broad, and the AB instructors could apply however they felt um, that most applied for their own students. But I certainly can forward you any of those that you might be interested in as well. So we're about to go into how do we go about um, implementing backwards design when we're looking at these application materials. And so I'm about to show you a notice of a decision form from New York State. I actually tried to find some from New Jersey, but I wasn't particularly successful, so I got close. um, so New York State, it is a notice of decision. So this would be a form that someone would receive after they've already filled out the first form. So I would like for you guys to take a minute and see what you notice about it. Notice about the notice. Can you guys see it okay?
I can, which I think that means everybody else can probably.
Okay.
So, and as Leah said, you can, as you're noticing things, feel free to comment via the question section. So you should see the notice of decision discontinuance from waiver program, bridges to health.
Yes.
Okay.
B2H.
B2H.
That's very helpful acronym that I'm sure they'll use later and won't define. Um, One of the things that I noticed was things like date of notice versus effective date, Medicaid CIN number. I don't know what a CIN number is, and they don't tell me. Some of the other things was that again, we have this conditional language. This is to inform you that your participation will be discontinued as of the effective date for the following reasons. So, could be any or all of the above. Would students have something checked there? How would it be submitted back to the students? Um, and then just kind of scrolling down a little bit more.
Regina
What?
notes, oh, sorry, Regina notes that it's a waiver type instead of health condition.
Ooh, that's a very good one. Yes, it
It
is.
really kind of misunderstand, what's going on and what's the nature of this application.
Yes. And so, again, just a lot of jargon. One of the things that stood out to me, I always like the fine print at the bottom of these. Um, They talk about you can ask for a conference, a fair hearing, or both. But do they ever really explain which one is which, or really what either one of those things could do for you? So,
Hey, why would I want something that's not fair?
right.
So
But then that
I'll
even
take the fair hearing, thanks, because the implication is the conference maybe isn't going to be fair. Um, Shannon also noted that she thought that the check waiver type was tricky,
yes, yes, check
and
one only. What if, for instance, what if more than one applied? What would
right,
you do? Pick the
right,
one that, and just for the ones here, um, I mean, we're talking about children. I would say if this was my child, all of those things would be significant concerns if more than one applied.
yeah.
And given what it is, they certainly could.
And Risa pointed out that there's just a lot of words.
Oh, yes, a lot of words, not a lot of white space. Um, and then where your eye moves across the form is not necessarily consistent. So,
Hmm.
for instance, here we're reading from left to right, whereas in this area we're reading top down,
Hmm.
theoretically.
Hmm.
Again, all of those very different types and styles of reading.
Hmm.
We talked a little bit about form, and the form of the form completely changes across um, as you read down. So we have our what did we notice. So if I were going to take that exact form and try to figure out how I'm going to use it to teach comprehension strategies within my classroom, what steps would I maybe go through to figure out what I would like to do with it? The first is what we just did, where the teacher is going to assess the actual authentic texts and really start thinking about maybe what content literacy strategy he or she might like to use to teach that particular type of um, information. And the second thing that I'm going to think about is, do I need to develop background knowledge with my students? Is this something that I think they, given that I've been working with them, have been exposed to um, or in their social situations or culture? Or is this something that's going to be unique and new to them? So I might want to think about, if I do need to develop background knowledge, how am I going to go about doing that? Again, some of the things that really stood out to me was some of the vocabulary, date of notice versus effective date, um, and then the ideas of a conference versus a hearing. What do How do we go about identifying and discriminating those terms? So I just kind of wanted to throw in a little note about technology integration. I usually try to pull in YouTube clips. Glad to hear that you guys are well acquainted with them as well. Um, I love them for building background knowledge quickly and efficiently. We usually conclude them by asking the students, what does this make you think of in your own life experiences? Now that you've seen this, does it remind you of anything else? Um, One little point that you guys probably already know, but if it does have closed captioning, I always do turn it on depending on what level of students I'm working with, because it does help to build print awareness and phonemic awareness simultaneously. That's just my little YouTube plug, I guess, if you
It's
will.
also good for English language learners.
Yes, absolutely. Um, Certainly. And so moving on though with how I'm going to integrate this information, I'm going to probably pick a comprehension strategy. Here I picked the Frere model. I don't know if it's something that you guys might be familiar with or not. Um, I think I have a little, there we go. That's what it looks like. It's just a little graphic organizer. And in the middle, you'll see that there's a space for the word to be included, um, definition, characteristics, examples, and non-examples. It does say definition, but I certainly don't mean the dictionary definition. It could be the connotation. It could, more than anything, be how are they defining this term for the purposes of this form. So teaching um, homonyms and homophones and all of those kinds of things, particularly when we're talking about application assistance materials.
Okay. The Freyer model is also, pretty adaptable.
It
So if you
is
if you think about the non-examples area, non-example could be an antonym, right?
it absolutely.
depending upon the type of word, if you have an adjective that has an easy antonym, if you've got a noun, you're not going to have an antonym necessarily. But the whole idea is just being self-conscious and monitoring your metacognitive awareness of this word and drawing on all these different skills to help you understand what that word means.
Absolutely. And honestly, I've even, speaking of ELL populations, I've used this with those populations quite frequently. And if they're not quite yet print literate, enough to feel comfortable listing out definitions and characteristics, I've also used pictures, or you can pull clips from the internet. Again, very, very flexible, as Eric mentioned.
And
Um, I do. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead, Leah.
Oh, I was going to say the non-examples in many ways are as helpful as the examples, the definition, and the characteristics, even though it's something that students generally struggle with. Because in terms of their metacognition, helping students figure out what this is not, and how it is not part of that part of their schema, is, I think, a really valuable thing.
What I was going to add was that I think, particularly when we're thinking about the language of forms and documents, is that calling attention to the fact that the meaning of that word in that context may be different than the meaning of that word in other contexts. And so
Absolutely.
those sort of graphic organizers can be very helpful with that. So that when the government says adequate, for example, that doesn't
Right.
necessarily mean what you think of when you say adequate, right? And so you
Exactly.
don't want to get tripped up on differences of opinion like that.
Absolutely. And so, what I usually will do with students is first model the strategy, and with something very banal like the word dad. So, who is dad? Just to go back, the one I have is bank. But a bank is a place where people can get money. That is my unofficial definition. It's big, it has lots of money, it has security there. Some examples would be things like Chase and Regions and Capital One. Non examples, McDonald's, Shell, Big Lots. Again, those are not antonyms necessarily, but certainly they're not banks. So, helping the students to clarify meaning is really the idea behind this one. Um, Help the students to have some fluency with the strategy. Um, Usually we'll practice it together in groups, guide the students to work together through one. So we might use something like date of notice, that first vocabulary word, to work together in a group and start to define what does that mean for the context of this application, and then go all the way through the strategy. And then I want to see if the students are picking up on being able to do the strategy on their own. So they're going to work independently with a different word or a different example. So mine is, the one that I chose would just be effective date. So again, helping them to make those distinctions for specific applications, and then also build their comprehension strategies and metacognition, or thinking about their own thinking as well.
As a dad, I certainly sometimes feel like I'm a synonym for bank, so that's a good combination.
Sorry about that. I thought there was going to be dad on the next page, but should have looked at that a little more closely. Um, so in terms of authentic assessment, so how do we know that if we are going to take our valuable, valuable time in our classrooms, to teach some of these skills with students, how do we know that they can then do it with their families at home, or with their members of their community, if that's something that they're going to serve the function of? Um, I would usually have some sort of authentic assessment. So if you had a question about this form, where could you get help? That might be a written response that I'll use to wrap up the lesson. Somebody else mentioned this in the write-in, but I'll use another similar form with students. So a lot of times some of these have A and B, or from forms from different years can vary slightly. That's a tricky one. Um, Having students repeat the process. And then you can also follow up next time with the notice forms that would follow from this same procedure, whether it's food stamps or FAFSA or FEMA or whatever it is that you're working with students with. I think one of the things that is important when we're starting to talk about authentic materials, and again, all of the semantics that are inherent is that um, we are not necessarily the experts in these types of texts. And so it's important to know who the experts are and seek help when you don't have strong understanding to be able to help your students. So certainly keeping in close communication with your local and state agencies. If you can get on any of their focus groups, I would say please try. You're going to, again, be able to give them really valuable information about how your students are going to interact with these types of forms. So reaching out to them in a proactive way to say, this is something that I'm working on in my classroom and I have these questions, again, puts you kind of in their consciousness. Job Corps, social workers. I love social workers. They are amazing. And they work with a lot of these same processes in their everyday experience. And they're a really good resource to know when the government says frequently or the majority of the time, they might have a little better indication about what that means for certain specific forms and materials. And then certainly, again, something that you guys mentioned, your local libraries, your librarians are also a source of potential partnerships and collaboration when it comes to bringing in these kinds of authentic texts into your classroom.
In the late 90s, early 21st century, as Equipped for the Future was the model that people were trying to promote across the country in terms of curriculum development for adult basic education. These sorts of collaborations were really prioritized, right? So that if you were thinking about what your what your roles were, your role as a family member, as a worker, as a community member, Equipped for the Future spoke a lot about these sort of collaborations at the local level to kind of understand your community and things like that. So even though that model has kind of like fallen away with the sort of prioritizing of the workforce model, all those people still are there doing that good kind of work, waiting to talk to people. Um,
Absolutely.
to double back, Risa had raised a point about YouTube and how in some classrooms there's not easy internet access or no internet access. And that certainly comes up in some places. And one of the things that I would suggest in those cases is that if you as a teacher feel like a particular video would be very, very helpful for your students, one thing that you can do is watch it on your own computer and do a screen capture. So you can record the video on your own computer outside of the classroom and then bring that screen captured video into the classroom. So you don't need internet access if you record the video on your own computer. There's screen capture that comes built in on many computers on a Mac. There's QuickTime and things like that, and there's some higher level sort of little pricier screen capture. But using screen capture is one way to bring these internet resources into the classroom when you don't have access yourself inside the classroom.
Absolutely. Microsoft PowerPoint makes it very easy to upload a YouTube clip and embed it directly into your PowerPoint slide. So that would be another thing to think about as well.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's another form of screen capture,
Mm-hmm.
essentially.
We got about 5 minutes.
Ah, okay. So, there we go. I kind of wanted to give you guys, we talked a lot about different types of assessments when we're talking about text complexity, the quantitative, the qualitative, and the reader in you. I wanted to give you guys some resources to go about assessing that so that you can bring whatever authentic materials make the most sense for your classrooms. Um, so one of the ones that just does the quantitative component is inside of Microsoft Word. You can turn on the Flesch Kincaid Readability. It's part of your spelling and grammar check, and it'll give you a somewhat rough estimate of the grade level equivalency of anything that you paste into a Word document. But two of the ones that I'd really like to point to that are related to the Plain Writing Act or the information that's inside of usability.gov as well as plainlanguage.gov. So again, those are two resources that I would point you to go and check out a little bit more about. And then if you would like to learn some more or different types of reading strategies, reading comprehension strategies, these are two resources that I use a lot with students in the K-12 sector as I'm teaching pre-service teachers, but I certainly use them all the time in my ABE courses as well, or ELL courses. So Read, Write, Think is associated with the International Reading Association, um, and you can type in the search box reading comprehension strategies, and you'll have fodder for days of interesting reading. And then the same with readingrockets.org. Um, the nice thing about Reading Rocket strategies is they um, classify the strategies by when you can use them and the types of information that you can use them with. So a pretty non-exhaustive list of resources, but just something to kind of get you started as you're thinking about how can you assist your students' metacognition and comprehension, and also bring in these real world, real life um, complex texts.
Mhm. Risa was very happy to see the reading rockets up there, that she says she uses reading rockets.
Awesome. I love it. I'm a big fan. They also have videos on there, which are pretty cool. You can see
Mhm,
some of the strategies being implemented in a real classroom. So,
mhm,
um, kind of mitigate some of that face threat of doing it for the first time with students.
mhm. I was involved in a number of years ago. I was involved in some research on authentic materials when there was still the National Center for the Study of Adult Learning and Literacy. So in
Wow.
the email that I send out, I'll also send some links to working with authentic materials that were developed about a decade ago.
Awesome. Well,
Um,
and
okay,
does anybody
Gaily.
have any questions? Sorry.
Yeah, so it's about a few minutes before the end of the hour. I think in particular, I'm going to switch over, Leah. I'm going to grab the screen
Okay.
and think about these are the texts that we had discussed earlier. Can everybody see these texts? The FAFSA, the taxes, the food stamps, the passport, citizenship, housing application, leases. Um, any last minute suggestions for how you would go about, or how you do go about working with these sorts of texts? Leah had provided a list before about, for this part of the form, you can think about previewing, comparing, contrasting, doing a problem solution analysis, classifying, that sort of stuff. What sort of strategies do you use to start to get into these sorts of texts, these government forms? If people want to share their wisdom just before we close.
Anybody have any thoughts? I think one that I wish I would have focused more on is even just think aloud, which of course goes into a lot of strategies. But as someone who has a high command of literacy skill, how do you go about thinking through your comprehension um, of these forms as you're filling them out?
Hmm.
I think that's a really powerful one that we don't necessarily emphasize enough, but
Hmm.
making our thinking clear to our students as we're reading these types of complex texts.
Yeah, I think that's true. Rice is talking about doing some vocabulary analysis and the wording. I mean, certainly some things that I've done with my students is really doing kind of like a sort of a text structure analysis.
Yeah.
You can highlight the various boxes, take a highlighter out and be like, all right, so this part is asking for, past information. This part's asking for future information. This part's asking for other people's information. And so you can kind of see how each form is structured and what's the nature of the information that it's requesting. As you said before, in each one of those boxes, it requires a different sequencing, uh,
Right.
and even where your eyes are moving. So to kind of highlight, it's all a bunch of small little text, right? But if you can color code the boxes and help them understand what each one of those boxes is for, then I think that can really go a long way. I think the other thing is to let them vent,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Like all of us, when we're doing our taxes or these other forms, we grab our hair, we scream, we get up and walk away and come back. And that's just, we do that because it helps us. We need to blow off steam. So I think we can let our students do that as well.
And I think one thing that I wish I would have emphasized in terms of choosing vocabulary, I allow the students with the application forms in their hand to choose the vocabulary that they deem as something that they don't understand. Because
Hmm.
I don't make the presupposition that just because I don't know what these two different terms mean, that my students don't as well. They
Right.
absolutely might. So allowing them some ownership of the process, I think, to go along with what Erica was saying.
Yeah. Yeah, I think particularly like, if you're dealing with something that you don't have much background knowledge on, right? So, I've never had to fill out a housing application. I've certainly had to fill out some of those other things. My students are going to have some knowledge of housing, the housing system that I certainly don't have, right? And
Right.
so I'm going to need to
And
work
this
with
is
them
where
on that.
those group collaborations and having the students have an opportunity to talk to each other is so valuable.
Yeah.
Certainly, there's more experience in the room than just the person in the front of it or on the
Yeah.
side.
Yeah. All right. So any last minute thoughts as we're up at the top of the hour?
I mean, I
As Vedi has talked about breaking the forms in small parts at a time, right? So in addition to kind of highlighting, you can literally, cut them up and break them up and highlight the various parts of the form.
oh, that would be really interesting too to cut up several different ones and see how they match or
Yeah.
don't match. It's a
I
good
think that'd
idea.
be helpful when there's like 3A, 3B, and
Uh,
3C are separate boxes, and 4 is A, B, and C is one box, and you can kind of see physically how these things are supposed to be related to each other.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's a good suggestion, Asvedi. All right. So we will be. I want to thank Leah again for for leading us on, I think, a really interesting and productive hour. These forms aren't going anywhere, right? And so this is something that we're going to be having to work with when we're working with students from here on in. So anything we can do to kind of help them and help ourselves become more comfortable with them, is really helpful. And thank all of you for your good suggestions, both in terms of the forms that you're using and the strategies that you use. I'll upload the archive edition of this. I'll send out the PDFs and the certifications. I hope you join us for future webinars. We've got 3 more scheduled for May. One on using learners' lives as curriculum. One I'm going to be doing one on technology, and one on the effect of violence on learning, the
Ooh,
effect of trauma on learning, which I'm really looking forward to. Um, and as always, if you've got an idea for a webinar, let us know, and I can help you set up a webinar, and y'all can host it. So thanks again, Leah, and thanks everybody else.
thank you guys for inviting me, and it was certainly awesome speaking with you.
Yeah. All right. So take care, everybody, and we'll hope to see you online soon.